Hello, and welcome to week 27 of Ari on TV. I'm Miss Jess. This week, I'm outside our virtual learning lab because we're talking about the stories we can find in nature. As we enjoy the spring, our thoughts turn to the natural world. Making a collection of natural things is a way to understand the variety of things on our planet. There are all kinds of rocks and animals, plants. Each has a story of how it came into being, like how a geode formed and the story of geology, the story of how sea glass came to be on a beach, the story of waves and the tides, the story of how a robin knows how to make a nest, the story of survival and care of future generations. This month, our theme has been, how are we a people of story? One of the greatest stories ever is the story of the origin of life on our planet. It's a story about how the natural world creates so many different kinds of life on our planet. Can you think of some? I'm thinking of butterflies, zebras, garter snakes, antelopes. But how did all these things come to be? There was a scientist in the 1800s who collected things while on a 5-year sea voyage to explore. His name was Charles Darwin. Some say he was the greatest scientist ever because he answered the question of how the story of the origin of life and how all these different and diverse plants and animals came to be. He collected tons of things while on this voyage. He was a naturalist. When he got home, he pondered his collections and what he saw. After 20 years of pondering, he wrote a book about his research, and he called it On the Origin of Species. Darwin's theory changed the way the world looked at how different animals and plants came to be. Darwin described evolution and natural selection. Darwin's story of evolution, of the origin of all the species of animals and plants on our planet, is part of our Unitarian Universalist living tradition. We look to science and reason to help us understand our story as living beings. We even put this into our UU principles and sources. The fifth source says, we honor humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science. We're going to learn more about Charles Darwin's story, but first, welcome into this quiet place of beauty. We come from busy things. Pausing for a moment for the thoughts that quiet brings. Our chalice lighter this week is Charlie.
We light this chalice for the warmth of love, the light of truth, and the energy of action.
From the time he was a little boy, Charles Darwin was an explorer. He loved to roam the fields and hills near his home in Shrewsbury, England. He was fascinated by the movements of small animals and insects, and knew each wildflower by name. He was curious about everything he saw and heard and touched, wondering at the lives of ants and butterflies, examining and collecting rocks, delighting in the grasses, trees, leaves, and flowers that provided homes for his very favorite creature, the beetle. Curiosity about the world and the place of humans in it was a gift given to Charles by both his grandfathers. They were Unitarians and believed that human beings did not yet know all the answers to life's great questions. The clues were to be found in observing the world around them. When Charles was 8, his mother died. Not long after that, his father decided to send Charles away to school, where he might learn the things that young gentlemen in his day were expected to know. Things like Greek, Latin, and ancient history. But Charles was more interested in the workings of an anthill or the mysteries found in a rock pile than he was in what was taught at school. At every opportunity, he took long walks outdoors, watching, listening, and collecting. He delighted in figuring out how creatures behaved and how the natural world worked. That wasn't at all what Charles's father had in mind. He was worried. What would young Charles do when he grew up? What kind of man would he be? When Charles was 15, his father sent him to medical school to become a doctor. That's what his father was and his grandfather. But he wasn't interested in medicine. Instead, he found people who would teach him all about different kinds of plants. He began to draw these plants in great detail, labeling all the parts, learning to tell one variety from another. 2 years later, Charles left medical school. It was clear that he didn't want to be a doctor. His father was furious and thought that the endless hours Charles spent outdoors were a waste of time. Determined that Charles would make something of himself, his father sent him to Cambridge University to become a minister. What do you think happened? Charles was not unhappy with that decision because in those days, ministers often did science experiments and observations in their spare time. Charles planned to find a small church in the countryside and spend most of his time observing and drawing plants, animals, rocks, and insects. He was still very interested in collecting beetles. One day, Charles tore a piece of bark off a tree and saw 2 rare kinds of beetles. He had one in each hand when he saw a third he wanted to add to his collection. Quickly, he popped one beetle into his mouth in order to grab the third, with very bad results. The beetle squirted something nasty tasting, and Charles was forced to spit it out. At Cambridge, Charles discovered what his life's work would be, and he began to call himself a naturalist. Charles went on a journey around the world, and as he traveled, he filled notebooks with drawings and notes. He stayed open to the curiosities of the natural world as they presented themselves. Frogs, salamanders, armadillos, insects, fossils, sure. When he returned to England 5 years later, he understood how plants and animals evolved from one form to another over the course of many, many thousands and millions of years. 22 years later, Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species, the theory of evolution, which tells the story or process by which organisms change over time as a result of changes in heritable, physical, or behavioral traits. Changes that allow an organism to better adapt to its environment will help it survive and have more offspring. Scientists, preachers, and teachers took notice, and so did the press. The theory has 2 main points. All life on Earth is connected and related to each other, and this diversity of life is a product of modifications of populations by natural selection, where some traits were favored in environment over others. The boy collector with the gift of wonder, a spirit of adventure and openness to new ideas, had become the scientist whose theory responded to the mystery of mysteries. Today, people still take notice and debate what Charles Darwin had to say. Our special guest this week is Mr. Ron. Now, Mr. Ron is a naturalist, scientist, teacher, and farmer. He loves learning all about nature and plants and animals and all the things around us, just like Charles Darwin did. Mr. Ron's going to tell us a story about another famous naturalist and scientist. Mr. Ron?
Hi, RETV. My name is Hutchinson, and I'm a sustainability professor at Stockton. And I'm standing here in the middle of a farmed area. This is a walnut plantation here, orchard where they're growing walnuts. But as you can see, they're all one kind of walnut. The diversity in here is very low. It's different than the ecosystem that we saw before that had many different kinds of things. So what I try to do at Stockton is to teach students how to grow more in line with the natural world. And that branch of study is called agroecology. It combines agriculture with ecology. And so we hope to train our students, and we hope to show the world that you can grow more food with less chemicals, less pesticides, less water, and feed the planet at the same time. We're back again. So this is, right now we're at the YOLO National Wildlife Refuge, and we're looking for some Mexican free-tailed bats that are going to come out of this bridge here. But first I'm going to tell you a story about Rachel Carson, which we're learning about today. And Rachel Carson was a world-renowned scientist, nature writer, and naturalist. And this piece here is by Doreen Kimball, and it's about her life. So there once was a girl who loved to write stories and poems. She often wrote about the land and birds around her home. Her name was Rachel Louise Carson, and she was born in 1907. When Rachel grew up, she became a writer and a scientist. Rachel wrote wonderful stories, and she always explained the beauty of nature so well that you can almost see what she was describing. As a scientist, Rachel also was very careful to describe things exactly as she saw them. She made sure everything she wrote was true. Since Rachel was always outside studying nature or writing about it, she noticed that a lot of birds and fish were dying. She figured out that the animals were dying from poisons being sprayed from airplanes to help farmers get rid of insects and damaged plants. Insects that damage plants. The poison not only killed the insects, but it also got into the soil and water and killed other animals. Eagles and many other birds and species of animals began to disappear. Rachel wrote articles and spoke to the U.S. Congress so everyone would know how we were destroying the environment. She even wrote a book about the problem caused by the poison. In her book, she described a spring where the skies were quiet and still because so many birds had died. She called that book Silent Spring. People who read Rachel's book started to demand that the government stop spraying the chemicals. The president and the Congress asked scientists to look at the chemicals to make sure Rachel was right about what she had said. At first, the chemical companies said that Rachel was wrong, but eventually scientists figured out that the chemicals were getting into the earth and water and were killing many animals, just like Rachel had said. Because Rachel kept writing and speaking until someone would listen, the government finally stopped using the dangerous chemicals and began to test new ones much more carefully. People still use poisons and chemicals in the wrong way today, but Rachel Carson helped start a whole new kind of environmentalism, a movement to control pollution of our earth. Even though Rachel was a small, quiet woman, she believed people have the power to save the environment. If Rachel had not been brave enough to stand up for the environment and fight for it until somebody listened, we might not have as many species of birds and fish that we do today. Thanks to this brave woman who always told the truth, we have bald eagles flying in our beautiful blue skies. Now the bats are just starting to emerge. They emerge when the light levels get to be at a certain level. And if you look behind me now, you can see them. You can see clouds of bats coming out of here. There's a bunch of them right there. So there are hundreds of thousands of bats that live underneath this bridge here. And do you know what they eat? They eat insects. And so this colony is here because Rachel Carson prevented insects from being poisoned by the pesticides. So now these bats have something to eat. This is also an example of nature being the solution to some of our problems. So bats can eat the insects that sometimes are pests for our crops. So the more that we understand about nature and the more we understand the interdependent web of existence, the better off we will be. We try to figure out how to grow things in a sustainable way.
Wasn't that fantastic? Our song this week is one I'm sure Mr. Ron and you will love. It's called The Garden Song, written by David Mallet.
Inch by inch, row by row, gonna make this garden grow. All it takes is a rake and a hoe and a piece of fertile ground. Inch by inch, row by row, someone bless these seeds I sow. Someone warm them from below till the rains come tumbling down. Pulling weeds, picking stones, man is made of dreams and hopes. Feel the need to grow my own, 'cause the time is close at hand. Grain for grain, sun and rain, find my way in nature's chain. Tune my body and my brain for the music from the land. Inch by inch, row by row, gonna make this garden grow. All it takes is a rake and a hoe and a piece of fertile ground. Inch by inch, row by row, someone bless these seeds I sow. Someone warm them from below till the rains come tumbling down. Plant your rows straight and long, temper them with prayer and song. Mother Earth will make you strong if you give her love and care. Old crow watching hungrily from his perch in yonder tree, and in my garden I'm as free as that feathered leaf up there. Up there, inch by inch, row by row, gonna make this garden grow. All it takes is a rake and a hoe and a piece of fertile ground. Inch by inch, row by row, someone bless these seeds I sow. Someone warm them from below till the rains come tumbling down.
Well, that's it for our show this week. Will you say the words with me for extinguishing our chalice? We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. I hope you find some time to get out in nature this week. Get out there and explore. Really pay attention and see if you can hear the story of the natural objects and animals around you. Until next time, blessed be my loves.